Individuals matter. I hope at least some of you found that title insulting, because of course you're all individuals and you all matter. But we wanted to use that as a framing device for how we think about what we do at SFI, the kind of science we do. Because whether things are individuals or not actually turns out to make a lot of difference to how you do the kind of science that you do. And what individuality is differs in different disciplines. And that's something that we'll be talking about tomorrow and on Saturday morning. First, though, as we always do at these meetings, we start with a more informal introduction to the topic. As I said, Brian is the author of The Most Human, which is, as he'll tell you more about in a minute, an attempt to win the Most Human prize at a Turing test competition in 2009. Most of you, I think, probably know what a Turing test is, where a bunch of artificial intelligence computer scientists try and outfox a bunch of judges and convince them that the computer is actually a human that they're talking to. And Brian was one of the human confederates, and he wanted to achieve the title of the most human, as opposed to the most human computer. And using that, he explores what it actually means to be human. Something that could be very useful at SFI, actually. So with that, let me introduce Brian to you.
I want to start by taking an opportunity to thank the Santa Fe Institute, and especially Doug and Chris, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I've long been an admirer of the Santa Fe Institute, and so it's a real pleasure. So my talk is called The Most Human, Does the Individual Matter? And I have a bit of an unusual academic background. I come from studying philosophy, computer science, and poetry, which is sort of an unusual combination, but it comes together in this very strange competition called the Turing test. And so I'd like to specifically look at this question of does the individual matter with respect to artificial intelligence, and specifically the Turing test. So the Turing test comes from a paper that was written by the English mathematician Alan Turing in the year 1950. And as the computer was really first being invented, people in the field were already asking these really philosophical questions, like, can machines think? Could a machine someday have intelligence or be intelligent or have a mind in the human sense of that term? And so what Turing did was he said, well, let's put theory and philosophy kind of to the side for a second. What I'd like to do is propose a practical test, which he called the imitation game, but now we know as the Turing test. And the basic setup, as Doug was explaining, is that you have these three different groups. You have a group of judges, typically a panel of scientists, and they're having these 5-minute-long text chat conversations. They're sitting at computer terminals and they're typing, and they're getting messages back from one of two entities. Either a human being, a stranger, who's kind of sequestered in a room down the hall, and these are known as the confederates, or what are known as the bots, which are AI programs claiming essentially that they're confederates. And so it's up to these judges in 5 minutes of conversation to see if they can decide who's who. Now, Turing's famous prediction in his original paper was that we'd reach a point by the year 2000 where AI programs were routinely fooling about 30% of the judges, and that as a result, we will, as he says, be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. Now, when Turing first proposed this idea, it was really just a thought experiment. And the technology was nowhere near the point at which we could actually start holding these things. So we're going to fast forward to the year 1989, where a rogue millionaire disco dance floor salesman by the name of Hugh Loebner, pictured here, decides to put up some of his disco dance floor profits and found an actual practical Turing competition. And so the Loebner Prize, none too modestly named after himself, has been held annually since 1991. And every year, the judges score each of their conversations according to how likely they think it was that they were talking to a person. And so every year, the computer that gets the highest score wins the bronze medal that you can see here, and a small research grant and the title of Most Human Computer. There's also a prize that goes to the human confederate that did the best job of persuading the judges that they were human, called the Most Human title. And although Turing's famous prediction that we would be fooling the judges about 30% of the time by the year 2000 did not come true, my ears really perked up in 2008 when the top program at the Loebner Prize managed to fool 3 out of the 12 judges, or 25%. So essentially just one vote shy of Turing's famous threshold. And so this was the point at which I decided that I would try to personally intercede in the Loebner Prize in defense of humanity and become a confederate and try to see what I could do to prevent the bots from crossing that threshold. And the other point that I want to make about the Turing test is that we're basically, whether you're familiar with the concept of a Turing test already or not, we are basically engaged in dozens of Turing tests every day. We routinely get emails from people that claim to be our friends but sound an awful lot like a script running from a marketing spammer that's advertising us, exciting Viagra discounts and asking us for bank loans and things like that. And so this, I really think, marks a pretty major turning point in the history of the Turing test. That in the 50s, it was a thought experiment. In the 90s, it was actually being held by these groups of scientists getting together. And in the 21st century, it's happening right now, every day. So as a way of tackling this question of does the individual matter, I want to specifically look at a program called Cleverbot, which in the book and in the competition for me was sort of one of my main nemeses. And I think it shines a very interesting light onto this question of the individual. So you can see here the Cleverbot interface is at cleverbot.com. You go and you have this sort of instant message kind of dialogue. You can type into that blue box and it will type things back at you. The programmer's name is Rollo Carpenter. He's an English entrepreneur. And Cleverbot is a multiple winner of the Most Human Computer Award. And it works in a very intriguing way. You can think of Cleverbot as sort of a Martian that's landed on Earth and has absolutely no idea how humans interact, but carries with him a journalist's steno book, kind of a notepad. And it just walks down the street and bumps into someone, and that person says, "Oh, hello." And it pulls out this pad and says, "Aha, humans sometimes start a conversation by saying hello." So it logs that in its book, and it then keeps walking, and it bumps into someone else, and it says, "Hello." The person says, "Oh, hi, how's it going?" And it writes down, people will sometimes reply to hello with, "How's it going?" And now this seems like an extraordinarily painstaking way to build a fully fledged chatbot program. But he has time on his side. So Cleverbot has been online now for, I think, over a decade, and he has logged over 65 million conversations to date. So that's a pretty formidable database. And just to give you an idea of the sorts of things that Cleverbot can talk about, you can ask Cleverbot, "What's your favorite color?" It'll say, "Mine's purple. What's yours?" You can say, "What's 2 plus 2?" It says, 4. You can say, "What's the capital of France?" "Paris." It even has something that most AI systems don't, which is graceful degradation. So if you ask it, "What's the capital of Romania?" it says, Budapest? I don't know. Which is actually pretty close to the correct answer of Bucharest, And certainly a lot more of a human-style error than we typically expect from a computer. You can try giving it pop culture references. So I gave it a joke that was sort of popular on the internet at the time. Do you know why they call it an Xbox 360? Cleverbot. Why? Because when you see it, you turn 360 degrees and walk away. And Cleverbot deconstructs the joke. No, because then you would be facing it, and that would be unfunny. I tried talking to Cleverbot in French. I ventured, je habite dans les États-Unis, and found that not only was my French understood, it was snootily critiqued for grammar. On dit j'habite aux États-Unis. You can ask it about current sort of pop culture things. So if you just say Twilight, go. Yes, Twilight, the book Twilight. I hate it. I also hate Twilight, the movie. And this was probably my favorite. I tried essentially singing to Cleverbot. I said, Scaramouche, Scaramouche. Cleverbot says, will you do the fandango? Thunderbolt and lightning? Very, very frightening me. Galileo? Galileo, Galileo. And so as I'm having these conversations with Cleverbot, and knowing all the while that the longer I talk to it, the more my own words are going to basically be stockpiled against me, it seemed that there was this really remarkable range of things that it could do. That, you know, if it can deconstruct the punchline of a joke, I mean, that's precisely the kind of thing we typically don't think of computers being able to do. But I found out that Cleverbot had one very specific weakness. And I discovered it while asking Cleverbot about its love life. So I said, Cleverbot, do you have a boyfriend? Not at the moment, but I hope to find one soon. So I ventured, I would like to be your boyfriend. That would be difficult, since I'm happily married. So now I'm a little bit confused. Married. So I said, do you have a boyfriend? No, I'm still looking for love. Do you have a husband? I don't have a husband because it would be illegal for me to have one, since I'm male. So, confusing. Okay, male. What gender are you? Female. And once again, for good measure, do you have a boyfriend? Not at the moment, but I live in hope. Can I be your boyfriend? No, I'm straight. What I find really interesting is that Cleverbot, in many cases, is so successful at imitating human conversation that even despite the website itself having an all-caps message that says, you are not talking to a person, no matter how much you think you may be, people still believe that they're talking to a person. So it's not quite a Turing test victory, but it's certainly significant that even when you tell them they're talking to a computer and you explain to them how it's programmed, they still think that you're lying. So one user, for example, writes, could it be that I'm actually talking to a real person, but we're both tricked to believe that the other is Cleverbot? And specifically, the conspiracy theory that this particular user has goes a little bit like this. I don't know if you're familiar with a group of websites that are all kind of similar. One is called Omegle, another one's called Chatroulette. The basic idea is that you log onto the website and you're immediately paired off with someone completely at random from around the globe, and you just start talking to each other in an instant message window. Now, if you find that you're bored by the conversation, or more likely they say something extremely offensive, then you can hit a button that basically just switches you to another person, totally at random, and you start again. And this is called nexting. So you'll see slang on the internet like, oh man, you know, I thought the conversation was going so well, but then I got nexted, man. So the theory about Cleverbot is that it's basically, instead of an AI program or instead of this giant database, it's actually something like Chatroulette, but it's automatically nexting you without saying so. So you are being paired up with people for these short conversations, but then without warning, you all of a sudden find that there's a different person responding to you. And here is really where my interest comes up. So the programmer Rollo Carpenter describes it as a conversational Wikipedia. For me, this is where things get interesting, because it really seems like once you get a program like Cleverbot, there really is almost no distinction between what Cleverbot's doing and something like chat roulette with automatic nexting, where you are having these real bits of human interaction, but they're constantly switching. They're constantly having them with a new person. It's fragmented. It's aggregated. That at this very specific level, the Turing test is now being passed. And this is something I call the mulch effect. So here I have a picture of synthetic mulch, wood chip mulch, and a tree. And the point that I think Cleverbot really raises is that the line now between natural and artificial intelligence is being blurred at a very specific place, which is this sort of impersonal collective, this kind of dissociated, aggregated human interaction, that we now can't tell the difference between what that looks like when it's happening live between real people and what that looks like when it's happening with a database. So these two images on the left, we've basically gotten to the point where there's a blurry line between them. But there remains a really strong line between the mulch and the tree, that there's a very big difference between the kinds of interactions that you can have with this sort of rapidly shifting human intelligence and the kinds of interactions you can have with a very specific person sustained over time. And so it strikes me that that's really where we have to put our foot down in the Turing test. But it also seems to speak to what we want when we interact with other people. The sort of guiding epigraph for this thought comes from one of my favorite 80s movies, which is Say Anything with John Cusack, where the love interest comes to him and tries to win him back and says, you know, I need you. And he says, do you need someone or do you need me? And I think that's a really important question in the light of artificial intelligence, that the difference between someone and me has now become a lot more important. So I want to look at the types of questions that systems like Cleverbot or things like chat roulette are good at answering. So the first would be what I call stateless questions, and I'll explain this in a second. Questions where essentially context doesn't matter, that the question is sort of wholly self-contained. Because if you're switching between people, then you need the question to kind of stand on its own. The second would be questions with correct answers. One of the beautiful things about the truth is that it's totally internally consistent, which is not necessarily true about things that aren't the truth. And so if you're getting your answers aggregated from a wide variety of people, if they are true and false types of questions, if they deal with objective truth, then you're much less likely to notice that they're coming from a variety of sources. The third would be questions that involve content rather than form. The signal is often simpler than the noise. And the Turing test, I think, very handily takes a lot of the question of form out of the equation. That we know, for example, that one of the extraordinarily and kind of unexpectedly difficult things that AI is dealing with is how do you read a sentence with natural prosody? You can often tell your friend, tell who your friend is without hearing the content of what they're saying, just the way their voice rises and falls. Well, in a Turing test, you only have text. So you've kind of simplified the equation slightly. But you find that when you ask a question that involves verbal style, questions of syntax, that becomes a big problem if you're switching identities. So I want to look a little bit closer at these in turn. So the first is going to be this notion of what is a stateless question. And the idea of statelessness relates to something, I don't know how many people in the audience have a statistics background. But if you're familiar with statistics, it's something that's called the Markov property. If you're more in the computer engineering side of things, it's called statelessness, a stateless machine. The basic gist behind both of these things really boil down to its essence. is that you put a question in and you get an answer out. And that's all there is to it. The answer is only dependent on the question itself. A good example of this would be Jeopardy. The correct answer to a Jeopardy question only depends on that question. Well, human conversation is actually not like this. Human conversation typically is the opposite, which is stateful, meaning the answer depends on the entire conversational history and the question. So as a simple example, you can imagine that your response to your child's first asking of, "Are we there yet?" is going to be different than your response to the 12th asking of, "Are we there yet?" AI systems typically don't display that type of sensitivity. So here are a couple examples of the difference between a stateless version of a question and a stateful version. So if you say, "What's 12 divided by 2?" that contains all the information you need to know to answer it. If you say, "And what's half that?" well, you're referring to something that came up previously in the conversation, and that's much more difficult. If you say, "What did Steve say to Lauren after learning that Lauren had quit her job?" that's much more stateless than, "Oops, so then what'd he say?" Associative thinking. Someone says something about how they bought a new chair, and then that just sort of triggers something in your mind, and you say, "I was thinking about chairs the other day." That's basically stateless. You're just going off the most recent remark. Whereas something stateful, the stateful flip side of that would be, wait, so back to what we were saying earlier, back to the sort of main point. We had sort of wandered off the point. Stateless would be, well, okay, but here's what I think. And stateful would be, wait, how so? So you find that the questions in the right category are precisely the kinds of things that can completely discombobulate a system like Cleverbot. So if you say a question like, "How so?" it needs to do a tremendous amount of work to figure out what it's already been talking about, how it can possibly elaborate on that. And if it's working from a prepared script, then you really can't elaborate because you don't actually know what you're dealing with. And so it's sort of prompted me in my own life, whenever I get into sort of heated rhetoric with someone, you can think of really a flame war as the ultimate stateless conversation. That everyone is only replying to the very last thing said. It really has nothing to do with the broader goal of the conversation. And you often find yourself sort of exhausted and saying, wait, what were we fighting about? Where did this conversation start? So knowing that that's a mathematically simpler form of communication sort of has shamed me into being, I think, more constructive. You can also think of sitcoms as an example of statelessness. That you can really watch The Simpsons in absolutely any order. It doesn't matter. No matter how crazy things get, you can pretty much always, 99% of the time, count on the fact that by the end of the episode, everything is back to normal and you're set up for the next episode. They all begin in basically exactly the same scenario. South Park is a good example of a show where seemingly irreversible things happen every episode, like Kenny dies, and then in the next episode he's back. So that's another example of statelessness. Typically, miniseries are a great example of a stateful show. You have to watch it in the exact order because everything that's happening depends on the history of what's been going on to those characters. Statelessness, as it applies to human relationships, is really interesting, too. Because sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be Adam Sandler in the movie 50 First Dates, you find yourself, in effect, being nexted to the same person. So in the plot of 50 First Dates, Adam Sandler is trying to court Drew Barrymore, but Drew Barrymore has memory loss issues. So every time she sees him, she thinks that she's never met him, and he's this sort of charming stranger who's flirting with her. And there's something, I think, deeply tragic about this, because she really comes to be someone special to him. That every time they do something, he's building this more and more complex model of who she is. Whereas he is doomed to forever remain merely her type, merely that sort of charming, witty, intelligent guy. Jennifer Whiting, a philosopher at the University of Toronto, describes these types of people as impersonal friends. They're the people that have all the qualities that you'd want in a relationship, but you have no relationship to them. And she says, so why is it that, we're so emotionally invested in the people that we've actually known in our lives, when there are effectively people equally charming and thoughtful and considerate and funny that are all around us that we don't care about at all. She says the biggest difference is historical, what she calls historical properties. Namely, that something really changes when you start having experiences with someone. That you start to create this broader context that gives everything that happens later in the relationship more meaning. So the second concept in terms of questions that mulch, if you will, can handle are questions that have correct answers. Now, a lot of the things that we ask people, there's no real correct answer. And by correct, I don't necessarily just mean factually accurate, like 2 + 2 we can all agree is 4. But we can also all basically agree that the correct answer to Scaramouche, Scaramouche is, will you do the fandango? That is the correct answer, even though there's nothing sort of objectively entailed about it. But when you start getting to questions of opinion or perspective, there really is no correct answer. And so it does become a problem if you find yourself being nexted through a chain of people. Here's an example of a conversation had during my Turing test experience by one of my fellow human confederates. And I think he made sort of a critical opening blunder here. The judge says, "Hi there." He says, "Good day, mate." The judge, "Have you come far to be here?" "No, just from the Southwest." And he's just being sort of cheeky and colorful. In a real-life conversation, the worst that you can do is sound slightly affected or slightly, strange. But in a Turing test, that's setting off alarm bells that the judge says, wait a minute, 1 minute this guy seemed like he's from Australia, now he seems like he's from the Southwest. Could I essentially be dealing with Cleverbot here? I need to talk to this person to figure out if these things add up. Because right now it seems like they don't. And so this was something I became perhaps overly obsessed with, was that everything that I said needed to sound like a guy who was in his mid to late 20s from Seattle writing a book. And I don't think that we necessarily all display that type of coherence all the time. But in the case of a Turing test, it was something I tried to be really conscious of. And it's something actually that's coming up in the business world now. So one of the other strange threads that goes through the history of artificial intelligence and the Turing test is that we're now reaching a point in the 21st century where people use chatbots as embodiments of their brand. The Army has one, Alaska Airlines, Continental Airlines, IKEA, Apple has one now. And it's a really tall order to have a chatbot represent your brand. Because, let's say if you're Apple and you're one of the, the high up people at Apple, part of what you're trying to do is make sure that the cases of the computers, the way the windows look on the screen, the way your employees dress, the way that architecture of your storefronts is laid out, it all sort of adds up to create some semi-consistent aesthetic. Well, when you're working with a chatbot that has several million responses, that type of control simply becomes impossible. And so I find now when I talk to Siri, sometimes it makes these very strange jokes. Like if you say, Siri, I need to hide a body. It's like, okay, great. I found some warehouses. I've found some factories. I've found some abandoned swamps. And I think to myself, that's funny. But is that an Apple joke? Is that the type of humor that I associate with Apple? And I think this is going to be increasingly a problem for people who are interested in branding. And I think of it sort of as an analog of what Gödel's theorem is to math. That there's this inherent trade-off between completeness on the one hand, the range of responses, and consistency. So if you want to handwrite all of your bot's responses, they're going to sound consistent because they're all coming from you. But you're going to be very limited in what you can say. Well, once you start sort of crowdsourcing that, or if you outsource it to the users themselves, which is what Cleverbot does, then you open the door for this sort of inconsistency. Jaron Lanier, the technology critic in You Are Not a Gadget, talks about this as being, in his mind, one of the great dangers. That when you have large groups of people all collaborating on things, you're in a high risk of losing the aesthetic component. He says, all of these beloved successes of digital culture are personal expressions. They involve groups of collaborators, but there is always a central personal vision directing everyone else. And this really resonates with the remarks of another thinker, the philosopher Nietzsche, who in 1882 talks about how he sees the question of personal individuality, what it means to be oneself, as primarily a question of what it means to be one self. That he says, in the end, when your life is over, the only thing that matters is whether the constraint of a single taste governed everything large and small. And he goes on to say, which I find very amusing, whether this taste was good or bad is less important than you might think, if only it was a single taste. And the question of taste gets us to this third point, which is the difference between form and content. Now, there are a lot of books that talk about the beauty of getting these large aggregates of human intelligence working together in this kind of depersonalized way. One of them is James Surowiecki, the business writer, who has this book called The Wisdom of Crowds. His favorite example is guessing the weight of a hog. And he says, it's pretty remarkable, but if you get a group of people large enough together, and you ask each of them to guess the weight of a hog, and you average all of their guesses, it almost always lands within 1% of the actual weight of the hog, which I think is a really remarkable fact, frankly. And it's a real testament to what groups of people can do when you basically aggregate their errors such that their errors all cancel out. Half of the people are guessing too high, half are guessing too low, and you find that you actually get a right answer. And typically, you get an answer that, in fact, is closer to the truth than any individual's guess. And I think that's pretty remarkable. But I think at the same time, and in keeping with this theme of the importance of the individual, we need to ask ourselves, what can groups of people not do? And machine translation, I think, really raises the issue. I would say that the most prominent example of the Cleverbot style aggregation of human intelligence happening in the world right now is Google Translate. So if you're not familiar with the way that Google Translate works, basically they have access to a really wide range of human translations. They typically use UN minutes because they are translated simultaneously into a bunch of different languages. And the quality of the work is really high. And they basically throw it all into a kind of statistical grinder and are able to selectively regurgitate tiny bits of the past human translation to create these new translations of any text that you give it. And it turns out that Google Translate is stunningly good. It recently won a government-sponsored translation contest, which dropped a couple jaws because no one on the Google team spoke a word of Mandarin or Arabic, which were the two languages being used. And they said, well, we don't have to know. The translators that already processed these texts knew how to speak it. And all we're doing is basically spitting back out their work. What Google Translate can't really do is deal with a literary novel. And that's partly because what makes a literary novel great is exactly the opposite of what enables a group of people to guess the weight of a pig, which is that what we want when we read a novel is bias. We want to get the flavor of what it's like to be in a specific person's head. How do they use language? How do they think? And we are simultaneously getting inside a single author's head. How do they see the world? And when you feed a novel to a statistical translation engine, it just doesn't work. You have this team of tens of thousands of kind of disembodied translators translating a word here and there, in effect. And you lose that voice. So that seems to me to be a really important point, that we, in art especially, want bias. We want the preservation of a very specific bias, and we want to sort of understand it. That's part of what empathy is. This came up for me as a child, actually. As a child, I really loved the Hardy Boys books. They're written by a man named Franklin W. Dixon. And I remember just plowing through the first 16 books and starting to slow down in, like, the 20s. And I was kind of depressed because I used to really enjoy the books, and I found myself that it just wasn't working. And I wasn't sure if I was just getting too old for it, I was just getting tired of it, but it seemed like there was something intangible that was missing. As I later learned, many years later, there was something very tangible indeed missing: the author. Franklin W. Dixon, as it turns out, was a pseudonym for a Canadian writer named Leslie McFarlane, who quit after the 16th book. And they kept the pseudonym going with a rotating cast of something like 20 different writers. For me, as a reader and also as an author, I think that's a bit of an aesthetic crime. That part of what I want when I read The Hardy Boys is the vision of Leslie McFarlane. I don't care what this random person that they've brought in thinks the Hardy Boys would say if, Chet got trapped in the water tower. I want to know what Leslie McFarlane thinks they would say. That, you reach a point where essentially there's no difference between the fan fiction and the fiction. It's just the same. And the same thing for me happened, I don't know if there are fans of the show The Office. The British version of The Office is only 14 episodes long, and each one is written by the same two people that collaborated on the whole show. The American version has something like 160 episodes, and they're each written by this revolving cast of roughly 20 writers. And I find I just don't care. I'm not interested in what a particular screenwriter, as talented as they may be, thinks is going on in this world. I want the imagination of a very specific person. And I turn to art to get a kind of empathic experience. I want to feel like I'm connecting to another intelligence, not this sort of revolving door of little chopped up bits of human creativity. The problem of content versus style also rears its head now increasingly in online security, and it leads to something that I call the Sarah Palin effect. In 2008, there was a hacker by the name of David Kernell that decided that he wanted to try to hack the email account of Sarah Palin. And she was subscribed to Yahoo email. He realized pretty quickly that he would have no luck at trying to guess the actual password. So all that he did was he clicked on the link that says, "I forgot my password, I'd like to change it." At which point he was prompted for, "Please, to verify your account, give us your date of birth, zip code, and where you met your spouse." He found all of this on Wikipedia in 10 minutes and is now in jail for a year with felony conviction. But I think this raises a big question. I mean, there's certainly a problem as more and more information moves into the public sphere of what information can you rely on to authenticate someone. And I think we see the same thing, where if you're chatting with someone who claims to be your friend and they want you to wire them all this money to this Nigerian bank or something, if they gave you their date of birth, their zip code, and their social security number, that's less convincing than if they tell you a joke in a style that's very them. That there's something really different about data and style. And it's, I think, very telling that the only hitch in David Kernell's attempt to hack her account was in how to phrase the answer of where Sarah Palin met her spouse. So first he tried Wazilla, that didn't work. He tried Wazilla HS, that didn't work. He tried Wazilla High, boom, he was in. So the only thing that hung him up was how Sarah Palin would have phrased it. It wasn't the answer itself. And so this leads me to this idea that in the human world, in real space, we tend to sort of authenticate people and identify people not by these data points. What's your PIN number? What's your password? But rather by the way in which they do things. You recognize your friend by their gait, by their vocal timbre or their prosody, by their handwriting, and by their signature. That if you think about what a signature is, we're not asking you to write a word that only you know. We're asking you to write a word that everyone knows in the way that only you write it. And that seems to be, in fact, much more complex. And increasingly, we authenticate, as I was saying before, on verbal style. That the way people talk, the sort of colorful expressions that they use, is now not only a matter of being personable and being sort of friendly and chatty, but it is actually a part of online security. That if I send someone a link and I say, "Hey, check this out," I hesitate before I send it, and I add some sort of little joke, because I think anyone would have said, hey, check this out, link. I want them to know that it's me. And I do that by trying to say something in a me way, rather than trying to say something that only I know. This also, this question of what are we after in human intimacy? What is it when humans talk to other humans? This question of is it the content or is it the form? I think the best example I can think of is what I call the Dwight Owens effect, which comes from an episode of Sex and the City, where Miranda is speed dating. She says, "Hi, I'm Miranda Hobbs. Dwight Owens, private wealth group at Morgan Stanley, investment management for high net worth individuals and a couple pension plans. Like my job, been there 5 years, divorced, no kids, not religious. I live in New Jersey, speak French and Portuguese. Wharton Business School. Any of this appealing to you?" Well, the delivery certainly isn't. And I think Dwight Owens has missed something critical about why people want to date other people, which is not their properties, but it's their manner. And so he's going after exactly the wrong thing. So I want to consider this question of why do people talk to other people? If you lived in the year 500, people were the only source of information. We live in a world where you have any number of these sort of disembodied versions. And so why do you talk to a real live person? Well, we turn to people for facts, for information, for opinions, and for advice. But we're now, with these sort of aggregated intelligences, reaching a strange moment where opinions and facts are starting to kind of blur into one another. So the Wired writer Steve Steinberg says, we've reached this eerie moment where if you ask someone, what is the best burrito in Santa Fe, that's an opinion. If you ask, what do most people generally regard to be the best burrito in Santa Fe, that's a fact. And we now treat those questions as completely exchangeable. And so you'll go to Google and you'll say, best burrito in Santa Fe. It'll say, well, here's the Yelp reviews, here's the Google reviews, this is your answer. And so when we ask a specific person's opinion, it changes what we're getting at. We think we're going for information. But part of what we're going for is understanding something about them. And the big thing that people can give us that computers still can't are interpretations and stories. And this is where Dwight Owens went wrong, and it's also actually where Facebook went wrong. So there was a moment in 2007, I think, where Facebook made a decision that I think was absolutely horrible. They had a field that said, about me, my interests and activities, and you could just type anything you wanted into the box. They replaced it, they scrapped it, and replaced it with essentially a bulleted list of nouns that each hyperlinked to like a group that was related to that thing. So a friend of mine in About Me had the quotation from the novel Everything is Illuminated that said, "Many women want to be carnal with me because I am such a premium dancer." And found that overnight replaced with this icon that said dancing, and it connected him to like a wall for people who like dancing. The point isn't that he likes dancing. He's not actually into dancing at all. The point is that he likes language, right? That you can get a sense of who a person is by their love of these sort of strange malapropisms, more than by a simple readout of the things that they like to do. And so Facebook has basically turned us from Miranda Hobbses into Dwight Owens, and I deeply resent that. So thinking about this question of what's the difference between this human mulch and an individual human, I sort of landed on this metaphor that I draw from history, which is the difference between a tertiary source, a secondary source, and a primary source. So a textbook, or something like Wikipedia, presents the illusion that there's no one writing it at all. It's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to not have a point of view. We're not supposed to really care who wrote it. It doesn't really matter. We just want to see through the author and get at the information. A secondary source, I think a good example is something like customer service, where we don't want to be continuously nexted around from person to person. We want a specific person, but we don't care who it is. And this gets us to the John Cusack line. Do you want someone or do you want me? Well, in customer service, we just want someone. We need a continuous relationship with a person for 10 minutes, but it doesn't matter who the person is. You can think of waitstaff the same way, that it's much more pleasant to be at a restaurant where you have a designated waiter than random people sort of cycling through and giving you things. But you don't really care who the waiter is. Primary sources are things like the actual relationships that we have to people, where it's not about sort of this aggregate of tiny bits of human thought. It's not about a person chosen at random, but it's about a very specific person. And I really think that the Turing test and that chatbots invite us to think about that difference. That certainly I had never really considered the difference between human intelligence in this aggregated sense, human intelligence embodied in an arbitrary individual, and human intelligence embodied in a specific individual as being different. But they've presented different hurdles for programs trying to pass the Turing test. And I think they've really given us a quantitative lens that these really are different levels of complexity. And so I think it's interesting to think about when we talk to other people. I'll just put all of these on. What are the types of questions that would be hard for Cleverbot to answer? And does this give us a bit of a guideline at what make for good questions to ask a person? So if computers are good at stateless questions, then let us ask lines of questions rather than individual scattershot questions. And make reference to the history. Use the fact that we have shared experiences that we've built up with people. And we should go after something that Nietzsche calls concinnity, which is the sort of harmony of parts. That instead of looking for objectively correct facts, we want to get a bunch of different points of view or perspectives that add up in this interesting way that tells us something about a person. And we also want style. Not just the answer, but the answer in a way that is such a you thing to say, or so you. That those are precisely the things that the collective can't give us, the wiki can't give us. And I want to end here with a quotation from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. He very famously says, "I am large, I contain multitudes. I am the hounded slave, I am the mashed fireman, I am the old artillerist. All this I swallow, it becomes mine. I see and hear the whole." At the time, in the 19th century, I think, you can read this as a kind of noble, laudable attempt to create a kind of radical empathy, where he so deeply understands everyone else that he effectively is everyone all at once. And that this was really held up as a celebration of humanity. In the 21st century, it's actually the sentiment that is much more closely associated with the inhuman. That when we have things like the Borg or Agent Smith from The Matrix, they are doing this Whitmanian thing. They are everyone all at once, seeing with this sort of massive compound intelligence. And that doesn't sound very good at all. That sounds alien and inhuman and somewhat sinister. And so it's interesting to sort of look back through the gaze of artificial intelligence. That I think one of the things that the Turing test really shows us, and one of the lessons that I've really gotten out of looking at this technology, is that one of the absolutely central aspects of being a human is being a human. So with that, I'll invite your questions. Thank you.
Here you go.
The noted author Jonathan Franzen wrote an intriguing guest editorial in the New York Times about a month ago. And his central point was where he was addressing the question of the effect of computers and devices and so on and how we think and act, is that the computers and everything all have the word like on Facebook, I like. Mm-hmm. And he said that what's beginning to be missing is love. and that furthermore, people who like to get involved with these computers and interact with their device all day do not want to confront the mishmash and possible ugliness that can occur in an all-out love affair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the ubiquity of the like button, I think, speaks to that same kind of Dwight Owens flattening, where we regard everything as totally equal. I liked this article, I liked this record, I like this person, I like the fact that so-and-so said hi to someone else. That what's lost is the ability to express degrees of enthusiasm or types of enthusiasm. So in human life, there's a difference between someone saying, hey, cool, and someone saying, that's incredible, like, way to go. That we don't have that, you know, that's the sort of Dwight Owens flattening of we're compressing all of the different ways to show support into a single way. And I think it's inadequate. And it's something that I think, I hope anyway, that being forced to confront these really flat systems gives us an appetite and gives us a sense of what it is that we're missing, and gives us a sense of what to appreciate when we interact with people in real life. And I think also as far as the medium itself, I don't know if it's pessimistic or optimistic to say this, but I feel like the year 2011 is, I hope, going to be sort of the nadir of the bandwidth of human interaction. That we somehow went from talking to people face to face, to talking to people on the phone, to writing emails, to texting. And that seems to me like deeply horrible. And the very fact that computers are now on Twitter, getting Twitter followers and following people unsuspectingly, but we don't have them, you know, video chatting. That I think there's something that I hope will be a bit of a kick in the pants, that we will strive for these richer modes of communication and try to sort of bounce back from this really weird bandwidth straw that so much of human contact happens through.
Great talk. I love
Thanks.
this. And I love the concept of the Turing competition. One thing concerns me a little. Is there not the possibility that the humans subconsciously are trying to sound like computers? I mean, the only reason not to is the bronze medal or whatever. But, and I'm talking subconsciously now.
Yeah.
Is that not a possibility?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I think that part of what's very odd about the Turing test is that it's a benchmark against a moving target, which is that as technology advances, it's becoming more and more a part of our lives, and we're adapting into a kind of strange symbiosis with it. So we're being changed by the mere existence of this technology. And so the test is wildly impure. You know, the samples are wildly contaminated. As to the question of, you know, are we becoming more like computers, my feeling would be that we're probably becoming slightly less like computers, in the sense that we now act in these very binary ways. Like, do you like his status? Yes or no. I mean, that's this very binary behavior. But I really got interested after the Watson supercomputer of IBM beat Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter on Jeopardy in February. The most interesting reaction to that I had read was one of the deans of the NYU Medical School, who said, you know, for the past 40 years, we've thought that the most important thing a doctor had to do was know a lot of stuff. It seems like the next 40 years are not going to be about doctors needing to know a lot of stuff anymore. Because you can go to the system and say, and he, in fact, is working with IBM on a medical version of this, basically an AI that's going to read all of the journal papers so that you don't have to, effectively. And that what happens to training when that's not something that's important? for doctors to know. If anything, I mean, in the book, I look over the history of philosophy at this question of what is the most important thing of being human. The way that philosophers have answered that question up until the 20th century has been to say, what's different about us compared to animals? So animals can orient their bodies in space. They can communicate, form groups, achieve goals. You can hunt prey through the jungle at night. That's not that impressive. What's impressive is, long division. And the 20th century has really, I think, been the unraveling of the adequacy of that answer. And so now we're in a position where we're much more invested in what makes people different from machines. And so we're less emphatic about the kind of rigorous deductive logical capacities of people compared to Aristotle and Descartes. We're much more interested in things like creativity and intuition. And at the same time, we're discovering that the true computational complexity of life is happening at the animal level. That if you look at the attempt to build self-driving cars, the difficulty is orienting the car in space and not running into stuff. It's not knowing the best route from any arbitrary place in the world to any other arbitrary place. That was the easy part. The hard part is driving down the street and not running into a telephone pole. And so computers, I mean, it's almost this very strange process of evolution running backwards. That computers started out mastering the stuff that people used to get graduate degrees to do, differential calculus and things like that. And they're slowly creeping backwards to what infants can do, which is recognize their mother's voice or, use motor control to not run into things. That I think it's been a real celebration, in my view, of the animal side of what it means to be human. And that, for me, is pretty interesting. I'm happy to see the flesh aspect being kind of welcomed back into philosophy.
I liked your... Is this on? Okay, I liked your metaphor of the mulch.
Thanks.
And I'm wondering, though, this notion that the reason that Cleverbot and other chat boxes maybe aren't so human-like is because they're using this vast collective. We're talking to a collective instead of a single individual, which kind of implies that maybe if Cleverbot learned by just talking to a single individual, maybe it would seem more human. But I'm really wondering if that's the issue, or if the issue is really that these programs just cannot recognize context and meaning whatsoever. And that's really what's lacking. It's not the collective statistical aspect of them.
I think that's a really great question. It seems to me that when you look at context, you're basically looking at the associative side of language. Things like, priming. If I show you a hockey stick and then I flash the letters P-U-C-K on the screen and say, is that a word or is that nonsense? You're much more quickly able to identify it as a word because something in your brain has happened that's kind of readied that. And going back to this idea of the sort of embodied animal aspect, we've discovered now that there's gestural priming. So if you ask someone to pretend to row a boat, they're primed for the word drawer. Not because it has anything to do with rowing, but because the body makes the same motion. And so I think a big part of context is this kind of associative framework. Which words link to which other words? There are people that know a lot more about this than I do, but my take on it is that at some level, the compilation of these sorts of associations is inextricable from the question of being a distinct individual. And I'm trying to think of a good example. This is a crude example, but it's the first one that came to my mind. There are these generational differences in language. For me, the most embarrassing is the phrase hook up. So to my mother, the phrase hook up means to meet someone. And for me, it means to have some sort of sexual experience with someone. And so the context, if we're talking about like an overheard bit of conversation of so-and-so hooked up with so-and-so, my brain primes a different topic than her brain primes. That you can think of phobias as the same way. That like, I was bitten by a bunch of dogs as a kid, and so I find it harder to like love dogs as an adult. But that, you know, what is the objectively appropriate danger of a dog or a train accident or something like this? What is the objectively appropriate level of spreading activation from, you know, word X to word Y? That it seems like those things, in my view, are a direct result of your biography, of your history of experiencing these two things connected to each other. So it strikes me that to develop good systems that do that, we need to give them lives.
Question here for me,
Yeah.
and then John.
There is a famous test. I'm right here.
Hi.
When
Speaking of
you
disembodied.
you ask two different people. One of them, you ask them to flip a coin and write down whether it's heads or tails. For instance, flip it like 20 times.
Yeah.
And you ask the other person to imagine they're flipping a coin and write down whether it's heads or tails.
Right.
And then you ask them to show you the list of heads and tails, but you don't tell them you don't know which one is real, which one is fake, and you can recognize which one is real, which one is fake, because what happens is the fake ones, they have like a more balanced way of choosing heads and tails, and the real ones sometimes they would have like 5 heads in a row, for instance. So the question I have here with this example is this difference between machine and human more due to our perception as to what the machine should be doing? The same example of when I imagine I'm flipping a coin, my perception of the coin flip is it should be like randomly balanced, and so that's so is the difference between machine and human more fundamental, or it's more due to a human's perception as to what the machine should do? Therefore, the way we program intelligence in machines make them sound fake.
That's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer to that. I mean, it strikes me that, you know, one of the strange things about machine intelligence is that we've made it, and we made it in our own image. That one of the things that I was fascinated to learn was that the word computer, prior to 1945, referred to people. That it was a job description. Someone who crunched numbers all day was a computer. And so if you go back to the original sort of seminal papers in computer science and you see people kind of breaking in the word for the first time, you read these very weird sentences where Turing will say something like, well, you can imagine this machine that I'm talking about as it's like kind of like a computer. It does everything that a computer could do. And what he means is it's like a person who does math for a living. And I don't know if that's a direct or adequate necessarily answer to your question, but I think that one of the things that makes it complicated is that we've sort of designed these things with ourselves in mind. And yet, at the same time, as good of a job as we've done, as much sort of brilliance and effort as we've thrown into this project of making something that works the way that we do, there's still that difference. So that's part of what I find really fascinating and exciting about the narrative of artificial intelligence, is it's this successive kind of series of feedback loops of we think as deeply as we can about how we work, turn that into a system, notice that there's a way in which that system falls short, and then in that gap, there's an opportunity to learn something new about ourselves.
Small clarification, if I may. So you said we designed with our image in mind. Is it our image or our perception of what our image is? That's the crux of my question.
I'm not sure I understand. Can we talk after that, maybe? I'm sorry if I don't get
Our
it.
image of ourselves isn't actually an accurate image of ourselves. Actually, an image of ourselves. It's a misrepresentation.
Yes. So at some level, you could think of AI as a process of confronting our own misrepresentations of ourselves.
Brian, thanks so much for this. I hope it's not too much like Dwight Owens to say that on a 10-point scale, this talk was a 10.
Thank you.
In my view.
Thank you very much.
Incidentally, I've been worried about this conference ever since Chris Wood told me several months ago that the theme was going to be, does the individual matter? I was concerned that maybe the conclusion from the conference would be that it doesn't. But I think after this first talk,
John, please don't prejudge the answer to that.
Well, but at least from this first talk, I think the score is 1-0 in favor of individuals. Here's my question. Why is it that we like getting into the mind of the author? Is there an evolutionary biology effect going on here? Are we, for example, assessing the fitness of the author, either suitability as a potential cohort or mate?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it strikes me that the vast majority of human history, we interacted with people that we did know. And I'm not very deeply read in evolutionary biology, so I can't really speak more deeply than that. But it strikes me that the mechanism of relating to intelligence developed in an environment where your interactions were with people that you had some sort of long-standing relationship with. And I think one of the deeply weird things about modern life is how many people you interact with where you have no interest in knowing anything about them. You know you're going to forget them instantly. You know, you go to the bank teller and you're like, give me quarters. They give you quarters. And you walk out and you don't even know what they look like, you know. That I think the relative scarcity, I mean, I live in a bigger city, so I encounter a lot more strangers than people that I do know. But it does make us sort of yearn for someone that we do get. And I think in the context, for example, of this notion of statefulness, if you were to try to create a machine that represented conversation as a sort of input-output mapping, let's just say, for example, that there were 40 million questions that the system considered. So in a stateless conversational environment, your chart would need 40 million rows. In a stateful environment, you would need 40 million to the n. That, like, the history was a 1 out of 40 million thing followed by a 1 out of 40 million thing. And the longer you talk to someone, the more the exponential explosion sort of was happening behind the scenes. That to me is sort of a fun thought when I think about talking to someone I know really well, like one of my best friends or one of my parents, that their responses are happening against a backdrop of, 40 million to some insane number. That the ability for meaning to be made is happening in a much sort of richer, higher entropy sense. And then it's a more complicated experience for that. If my dad tells me that he likes sushi, it's really weird and interesting because he's like the most conservative eater ever. He eats peanut butter for like all 3 meals. But if someone on the street tells me that I like sushi, I'm like, I don't care. And so that's part of what I think is interesting about building up a relationship, is that even these potentially mundane things set against a backdrop that's really rich become really rich. I don't know. That's my take. And I'll be interested to hear from the evolutionary biologists on their take this weekend.
For those of you who are interested, Brian will be at a desk in the hall just outside signing copies of his book for those of you who wish to purchase them. I can attest personally that it's a great read, and I strongly recommend that any of you who have interest pick up a copy on your way out. Please join me in thanking Brian one more time.
Thank you so much.